Chapter 35. Grace knew Myron wouldn't be content with taking photographs for long. She should have tried harder, posed for the camera. When he'd started to manipulate her this way and that, she should have played it up. Maybe, if he'd gotten lost in his art, he'd have forgotten the rest. But even though he'd been clear about his plans, she hadn't had the stomach to pretend. When he stepped from behind the camera, his dark figure almost hidden on the far side of the bright lights, she'd known what was coming. He moved to a different camera, looked through the lens, and then stepped away. He would be filming this. Better me than Lily. The thought brought a modicum of comfort. He approached the bed, anticipation in his features. She scooted away until she reached the corner, pulling her knees to her chest. He crawled onto the bed and yanked her feet out from under her. She'd known he was strong, much stronger than she was, but the strength in that one move sent panic to her throat. He hovered over her, whispering, "Feel free to fight. It'll make a great show." And then he lowered himself to kiss her. She told herself to remain still as a stone, to not react. But her instincts kicked in. She knew the camera was picking it all up, knew he'd probably enjoy watching a replay later. Intellectually, she knew, but she fought him anyway. He seemed to love it. Though he could have easily overpowered her, he allowed himself to be pushed back. It went on for hours and hours, or so it felt, him trying to take her clothes off, her fighting to keep them on, him trying to kiss her, her turning her head, him trying to touch her, her squirming away. She had no hope. She knew that. She knew he'd eventually tire of the game. When he did, she wouldn't have a chance of escape. He was bigger and stronger. She could feel his cage strength when he gripped her wrists. Whenever she got them loose, she knew it wasn't by her own power, but by his mercy. No, not mercy. Showmanship. That was all, nothing more. Even knowing all that, she fought him. And when she peeked, she mostly kept her eyes closed, and not just because of the bright lights overhead, and got a glimpse of him, she knew he was enjoying every second of it. But then something shifted. She felt a change and opened her eyes. The amusement was gone from his face, replaced by dark lust. He yanked her hands over her head and pressed his palm to hers, pinning her in place. She felt what he felt, lust and possession and power. Terror filled her heart and ripped a scream from her mouth. He laughed, the sound low and vibrating in her ear. "That's good. Don't worry about waking Lily. This room is soundproof, too." He loved it. She could feel how much he loved her terror. She tried to hide it, but couldn't. He slipped his hands off hers, and the darkness lifted from her mind, but not her body. His fingers moved over her middle, reached the button on her jeans. She tried to squirm away, but he wasn't playing anymore. He pinned her to the mattress, and she was powerless to stop him. A bell rang, loud and shocking. Myron stopped, propped himself up on his arms. She tried to wiggle out from beneath him, but he slid his hand over her neck and squeezed. "Be still." She obeyed, and he let up the pressure the tiniest bit. The bell rang again and again. A doorbell. It had to be, though it was magnified as though through a speaker. Maybe it was. This room was soundproof, so he'd need a way to know if somebody was at the door. But it was the middle of the night. Myron let out a stream of curses and climbed off her. He straightened his clothes and patted down his hair. The bell kept ringing. He walked to the doorway. It had a combination lock, and he punched the buttons. She couldn't see what numbers he hit from where she was lying. The door clicked, and he pushed through it. She bolted off the bed and shoved her foot in the doorway. The bell was still ringing incessantly, which had to explain why he hadn't noticed the door didn't close behind him. Whoever was out there was determined. Maybe it was the police? She heard him pound up the stairs and across the floor over her head. Heart racing, she reached for one of the pillows on the bed, but her arms weren't long enough to reach. There was nothing else. She slipped off her boot and shoved it in the doorway, then grabbed a pillow to put in that space to keep the door open. She pushed through to the basement. The door upstairs would be locked. She'd heard it slam. The window, though. She grabbed a stool from Myron's studio, shoved it beneath the window, and climbed up. The doorbell stopped ringing. Voices filtered in. Was the rest of the basement soundproof? She considered screaming, but would that bring help, or just bring Myron back? The window wouldn't open. But, unlike the ones upstairs, this only had the one pane. It was tiny, and she wasn't sure she'd fit. But Lily could. She ran through the studio and into the bedroom, where Lily lay sound asleep. "Wake up, sweetheart." She grabbed the child's clothes and started shoving her feet into her sneakers. Lily was half awake. "You have to wake up. There's somebody here. I'm going to lift you out the window, and you're going to run to the front of the house and scream. Tell the man you need help, that you've been kidnapped." Lily shook her head. She looked terrified. "You have to, honey. It's the only way." As soon as the glass broke, Myron would come running. Lily would have to get out fast. Grace found a sweater and shoved it around Lily's shoulders, then lifted her and carried her through the studio, setting her down a good distance from the window. "I'm gonna break it and then lift you out, okay? You'll run that way." She pointed to the right. "To the front of the house. Hear the voices? I think it's the police." She had no idea if it was the police. She hoped so. She hoped it was somebody looking for them, sending Lily out to who knew what. It was dangerous. But nothing was as dangerous as staying in that basement. Lily shook her head hard. "I can't leave. He'll be mad." Grace crouched down to Lily's level. "You have to get out of here." Her little head shook. "Don't you trust me?" But Lily's eyes only widened further. And who could blame her? Grace hadn't protected her. She'd promised, and she'd failed. Grace needed to know how to convince Lily to go. She needed to see into her heart. She swallowed her fear, took a deep breath, and gripped Lily's hands. All the ugly things came. The pictures Myron had taken of her. The way he'd manipulated her, treated her like a possession. She felt fear and shame. But behind all that came bright and beautiful emotions. Love and tenderness and kindness. She saw herself in Lily's eyes, a protector. She felt Lily's love for her, and her uncertainty. If Grace didn't love her, could she be trusted? She let the child's hands go and slid her palms over Lily's little cheeks. "I love you, sweet girl. I love you with all my heart." They might have been the truest words Grace had ever spoken. "I need you to be safe. You are priceless and worth protecting. Please, please trust me. Please go out that window." Eyes still round as marbles, Lily said, "What about you?" She didn't know if she'd fit and didn't think she'd be able to hoist herself up. "Tell them I'm here. They'll rescue me. You can do it, darling girl. You can do it, okay?" But the voices had faded. Footsteps pounded on the floor overhead. The door at the top of the stairs opened. Grace grabbed Lily's hand and, snatching the pillow from the floor, let the door to their prison shut. She pulled her through the studio and into the bedroom. "Wait here." After propping the bedroom door against the pillow, she grabbed the metal pole from the floor where Myron had dropped it. Positioning herself beside the entrance, she lifted it. Because of the bright lights still aimed at the bed behind her, she was in shadows and prayed it would be enough cover. Myron reached the bottom of the steps and uttered a curse word, pounding across the space. He pushed through the thick metal door and paused to let his eyes adjust to the light. She swung the metal pole like a baseball bat. It connected with his head, and he went down. She stood over him and hit him again, a scream crawling up her throat. It escaped as the rod connected with his skull a second time. He didn't move. She stepped back, hands trembling. She'd done it, but he moaned and rolled to his side. She didn't have long. "Lily!" The child stepped out of the bedroom. "Come on, let's go." She lifted Lily and stepped over Myron into the basement, expecting him to grab her foot or do something to take her down. He didn't. Thank God. She wanted to pull the hidden door closed to lock Myron in, but his body had fallen half in the doorway, and she didn't dare move it. She dashed up the stairs, but the door was locked. She banged on it, screaming. But nobody was up there. Whoever'd been there was gone. She had to get Lily out. She hopped over Myron again. This time, he grabbed a hold of her jeans and yanked. She shook him off and somehow kept her balance as she hopped away. She grabbed the pipe, swung it at his head again, and rushed past him to the window. With rage and fear still coursing, She smashed the end into the glass. It crashed loudly, pieces raining on her. She used the pole to clear the edges, then turned to Lily, who was cowering against the far wall, thumb in her mouth. "Come on, sweetheart. Let's get you out of here." After that, she'd get the keys out of Myron's pocket. But not until Lily was safe. And if somehow Myron stopped her from escaping, she wouldn't think about the miles and miles of forest out there. Somebody had been at the door. Somebody would find her. "Please, God, please!" She hoisted the child in her arms. Lily didn't protest, but it was harder than Grace had thought it would be to lift her high enough. She didn't want to stand on the stool, afraid they'd both fall. "You can do it, sweetie. Just pull yourself up." "I'm scared," Lily said. "It's so dark." A gloved hand came through from the other side. "I got you." "Andrew?" It couldn't be. He said, "Take my hand, sweetie." And then, "You okay, Grace?" A million questions filled her mind. Her heart seemed to swell to twice its normal size. Before she could respond, Lily was pulled from her arms. Grace peered up at the open window, and Andrew's face filled it. "We're trying to get inside. If you want to sit tight?" "No." She turned toward where she'd left Myron. He was lying still. Had she knocked him out? Maybe. "I need to get out now, before he wakes up." She moved the step stool into place and climbed on top, but looking at the small window, she said, "I don't think I'll fit." "There's plenty of room," Andrew said. "Give me your hands." He held his through the window. He'd taken off his glove, probably to get a better grip on her. She'd feel everything he was feeling. She didn't even hesitate before she slid her palms against his. While he pulled her through the window, the bottom scraping against her middle, she reveled in the feelings filling her heart. Relief, gratitude, and love.
Chapter 36. The second Grace cleared the window, Andrew swept her into his arms and held her tight. She held him back, and he wondered if they'd ever be able to let go. Lily hovered beside him, holding Regis in her arms, kissing him and cooing. The dog was going crazy, licking her face and wriggling to get away like Tigger on steroids. Lily was safe. Grace was safe. Andrew couldn't push words past the emotion in his throat. He backed away, but Grace didn't release her grip. "Sweetheart, where is Bowman?" "I hit him hard in the head. A couple of times." "Where? Is he alive?" She glanced behind her at the basement window. "He was when we left him." Her voice cracked and he could feel her sobs. "It's okay. You're okay." Garrett approached. "No keys in the Polaris. They must be in the house." "We'll have to break the door down." Andrew gripped Grace's upper arms and pushed her back so he could look at her. "Are you all right?" She nodded, took a deep breath, and then scooped Lily up, dog and all. 30 seconds of weakness, and she was strong again. Wow, he loved this woman. "Grace," Garrett said, "did you see keys? Or maybe a cell phone?" She shook her head. "The keys to the thing we drove here in, they're in his pocket. Can't we just take your car? How did you get here?" "Same way you did," Andrew said. Garrett looked back at the house. "So we break it down. Door, window, or we could go through the basement." "The door to the upstairs is locked," Grace said. "You won't be able to get into the house that way." Andrew started toward the back, pulling out the handgun. "You suppose I could shoot the lock off? Or does that just work in movies?" Garrett chuckled. "Let's not try it." "The windows are nailed shut," Grace said. "Maybe we can break the door down, or—" "No need." Garrett ran toward the street, calling over his shoulder. "I think the cavalry's here." Andrew had never been happier to see the glow of red and blue lights. Sure enough, the police had arrived. A click drew his attention to the house. The back door was pushing open. Grace had her back to it, facing him, Lily in her arms. Neither of them saw what he did. Bowman stepped onto the back stoop, the barrel of a long black gun raised. "No!" Andrew tackled Grace, pulling all of them down. The blast of the shotgun exploded in his ears. Somebody screamed. Andrew rolled off Grace, made it to his knees. The pistol was in his hand before he'd registered his need for it. He aimed. Bowman charged, screaming obscenities, the long barrel of his gun swinging their way. Andrew fired. The man took another step forward. 2. Andrew fired again. The gun was aimed at Andrew's chest. He braced for the impact, squeezed the trigger once more. But the shot went over Bowman's head as the madman stumbled, fell face first into the snow. Someone was still screaming. Screaming. There were shouts in the air. "Drop it! Drop it now!" A police officer rounded the house, gun aimed not at Bowman but at him. "Drop it." Another man came around the house. His voice was low and calm. "You got him, son," Chief Coates said. "They're safe. Drop your weapon." Andrew let the gun fall at his knees. He lifted his hands. But before the police reached him, Grace threw her arms around him and held him tight. Was she okay? He couldn't make his voice work to ask the question. Lily gripped him from behind, her tiny head pressed against his shoulder. She was saying something, but he couldn't process the child's words. It was okay. They were okay. He shifted to pull Lily into an embrace, slid his other arm around Grace, and buried his head in her hair. Maybe that would hide the tears. "Just standing out there in the open like that?" Fitz shook his head. "Stupid rookie mistake." Andrew lay on a gurney in the back of an ambulance. He was fine, despite the cuts the paramedic kept calling gunshot wounds. He'd been shot. He hadn't even felt it. Even as he'd held Grace and Lily, he hadn't felt pain. No wounds on either of them, thank God. None that he could see anyway. Though the look in Grace's eyes had him wondering what she'd gone through. He didn't want to think about what Bowman had done to her. She was in the back of another ambulance telling some stranger what had happened. She would tell Andrew everything eventually. Now that Bowman was gone, there was no need for secrets. "You got to take cover." Fitz was standing at the back of the ambulance, oblivious to the snow in his hair or Andrew's wandering thoughts. "Unless you've checked to make sure the perp doesn't have a pulse, you got to assume he's still a threat." "Why don't you write all your tips down for next time?" Andrew suggested. "I'll study them. You can give me a quiz, make sure I've got it." Fitz just smiled, that irritating Hollywood leading man smile. Let's hope there's not a next time. Amen to that. Beyond Fitz, a car door slammed, and Andrew sat up to try to catch a glimpse of Grace. The paramedic pushed him back down. The action had his shoulder throbbing, thanks to the gunshot wound. Wounds. Plural. Which explained why he couldn't move his left arm. Andrew did his best not to flinch, but knew he'd failed when Fitz chuckled. "Sure, take on a madman, no problem. But a little pressure on your boo-boo. Don't you have anything else you could be doing?" "Sadly, no. Local cops are handling it. They let me come along as a courtesy." "Not feeling like a courtesy to me," Andrew grumbled. "How'd you guys figure out where we were anyway?" Thomas came back and told Code about the dog and the trail. He and 2 of the cops rode up the path and found the marker showing which way you'd gone. Cops radioed it in. "Not a whole lot of structures up here, so we headed this way. But you guys couldn't wait." "Wasn't like we knew you were coming," Andrew said. "How'd you get Grace and Lily out?" Garrett went to the front and rang the bell and banged on the door, hoping to distract Bowman while I got inside. But the door and windows were sealed tight. I could hear Garrett and Bowman talking around front while I looked for another way in. There was a light on in the basement, so I went that direction. I was almost there when I heard the front door slam. I ran to the front and saw Garrett standing on the stoop. He said the guy told him to get off his property or he'd call the police. Garrett didn't want to give away that he knew who he was, so he apologized for bothering him. What was his excuse for knocking on his door in the middle of the night? Said he was looking for a lost dog and saw the light on. Fitz glanced at the house. It was dark when we drove up, just that dim basement light. Yeah, Garrett and I were trying to decide what to do next when I heard a crash. Grace had broken the basement window. She was trying to lift Lily out. Andrew remembered seeing Lily's little hand, seeing Grace, getting them both to safety. His heart raced as if he were in that moment again. "I pulled them out," Andrew finally said, "and then stayed out in the open, sitting ducks." Andrew glared at him. "Are you trying to help?" Fitz chuckled. "Just saying, I'm glad you're alive. I think God must have been watching out for you. What's that saying about how he takes care of babies and fools? Feel free to run along." Fitz wandered away, chuckling, and Andrew shifted his attention to the paramedic. "Are we done here?" "Try to relax," he said. "It'll take an hour to get to Plymouth." I don't need a hospital, he said. Gunshot wounds get infected. It'd be really dumb to die of sepsis because you don't feel like taking a trip to the ER. The guy wasn't wrong, so fine. He'd go to the hospital. Can I just check on? I'll get her for you. The lady, right? The blonde? The paramedic called to someone. A few seconds later, Grace climbed into the back of the ambulance, concern marring her beautiful features. They say you're going to the hospital. Stitches and antibiotics. That's all I need. Is Lily all right? Nodding, Grace kneeled beside him and rested her head against his chest. Thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you for... Don't thank me. She lifted her head to look at him. I'm so sorry about everything I said. I was an idiot. I should have supported you. I shouldn't have lied to you. I put you in a terrible position. For good reason. She slid her finger on the back of his hand, looking at him for permission. He slid his palm over hers. Closing her eyes, she laid her head on his chest again. He wasn't afraid for her to know how he felt. Gone was his anger toward her. Gone was his fear of prison. Gone was all of it. He felt overpowering gratitude that she was alive. And more. So much more. She leaned back and kissed his cheek. Me too. All of it. She took a deep breath, smiled and said, I love you too. Chapter 37. Andrew was bored, though considering all he'd gone through in the previous couple of days, bored wasn't all bad. Grace and Lily had been to the hospital to visit him earlier that day and the day before, but they hadn't stayed long. Not that Grace hadn't wanted to, but she'd been focused on Lily and her emotional health, which was right and made sense. Didn't make him long for her any less, though. He was still in the hospital because the doctors were paranoid. They'd told him the wounds in his shoulder and upper arm would all fully heal, and he'd recover. Bowman had shot him with a shotgun, which explained how one squeeze of the trigger had left so many holes, all of which could get infected. He felt fine. He told that to every nurse who came in, and they all smiled and patted him on his good shoulder and pretended he wasn't demanding to leave. Which he wasn't, not really. He had way too much to live for to die now. Fitz pushed through the wide door. Knock, knock. Dylan came in behind him. Cop and former cop. They both had that same back-straight, eagle-eyed look about them. So you knew she kidnapped the girl, Dylan said, getting right to the point. Fitz shot a look at the other man. I thought you agreed to let me handle this. Dylan shrugged, never taking his eyes off Andrew. Andrew laid his head back and closed his eyes. I'm feeling a little lightheaded. Sure you are, Fitz said. Andrew opened his eyes to the sound of a chair scraping. Dylan sat, and Fitz stood at the end of the bed. He'd confessed everything to Dylan in his frantic phone call Friday night. He'd been surprised the cops hadn't come by the day before, and had half hoped Dylan was going to let it go. Nope, they decided to wait until Sunday. It was fine. Whatever happened now, Andrew would handle it. If he faced criminal charges, so be it. He prayed Grace wouldn't. She'd already given so much for Lily. Would she have to give her freedom as well? I found out Thursday night, Andrew said, and told her to run. Dylan stretched out his long legs in the chair. I'm just spitballing here. You didn't want to turn her in, but you also didn't want to be a party to kidnapping. That's why her boxes were packed, right? It took me a little while to put it all together. Is she going to be charged with anything? Fitz fielded that. The child was never reported missing. Not by the mother or grandmother or Bowman. The county in Washington where they lived isn't going to be interested in pursuing charges, not after how they botched the search. That got Andrew's attention. What do you mean? Once Coates saw the basement where they were held, Fitz said, he put in a call to the detective in the little town in Washington where she used to live. He told her what happened and asked how thoroughly they'd searched the basement in the house there, and described Myron's modifications. The detective there issued another search warrant and found a hidden room. It was empty, of course, but that must be where he hid the evidence when the cops searched after Grace reported what she'd learned. Grace saved Lily, Dylan said. Nobody disputes that, and she's been working hard to find the girl's family. They're itching to get her back, but Grace refused to leave until she knew you were all right, and she also refused to turn Lily over here. She insisted she needs to accompany her to Texas and see her settled. Andrew'd known that part already. He planned to go with them and had already asked Jackie for the time off. And then he'd missed the conference he'd worked so hard to put together. But Jackie and Braden and the other B&B employees had handled it. Apparently it had gone well, and many of the prospective employees expressed an interest in moving to Plymouth. With the weekend behind them, Andrew could afford to take a few more days off. They were hoping to leave for Texas on Wednesday. Darla Springer had waited years for Lily's return. She could wait a few more days. She'd be stronger too, more recovered from the knife wound that had almost killed her. All that to say, Fitz paused, probably for dramatic effect. Just spit it out. The detective smiled. Obviously, she's a hero, and I guess in some sort of weird way, you are too. You saved their lives. Grace saved Lily's. Nobody's going to charge either of you with anything. The words lifted a weight off his chest. Dylan set Andrew's laptop bag on the adjustable tray. Your computer, as requested. Thanks for grabbing that for me. No problem. You need anything else? He had his laptop, which would give him access to all the records Dad wanted him to look into. Since he had nothing but time, he might as well solve that mystery. One more thing. Fitz's fingers curled over the plastic rail at the end of Andrew's bed. The cops have been going through Bowman's images. Andrew's disgust must have shown on his face because Fitz added, Yeah, I'm glad that's not my job, but they found something that, he shook his head. The mom, Annabeth Springer? We think he murdered her. He took photos of a body. They're matching the images with those they have of Springer before she left with Bowman. Police are trying to figure out where they were taken so they can find her. Dylan said, At least now the family will know. What a monster, Andrew said. The guy convinces Annabeth to leave her mother, then when she's cut off all contact with everybody she's ever known, murders her. There's nobody to report her missing and no way to trace her, even if the parents want to. Then he's got the kid, free and clear. Sick, Dylan said. Nobody'll grieve Myron Bowman. Fitz shook Andrew's hand. Well done. Dylan squeezed his good shoulder, and the two men walked out, leaving Andrew to consider all he'd learned and to dig into his father's business finances.
Chapter 38. Grace held one of Lily's hands. Andrew held the other. Together, they walked up the walkway to the little house in Flower Mound, Texas, Regis on their heels. The door opened, and Darla Springer filled the opening. Grace had expected her to look grayer, sicker, but her skin was pink and healthy just a week after Myron stabbed her. Somehow, though his intent had been to kill, the knife hadn't hit any vital organs. She might have bled to death if someone hadn't found her quickly. Only God could have orchestrated those things. Grace could almost imagine his hands stopping the blade from penetrating too far, then turning a woman's head to notice Darla on the pavement. Lily froze at the sight of her grandmother. Even though Grace had told her where they were going and who they were going to see, Lily still seemed stunned. She pulled away from Grace and Andrew and stepped forward. Before Grace could feel the loss, Andrew's arm slipped around her waist. Together, they watched Lily approach Darla. She stopped a few feet away. Nana? Darla crouched down and held her arms open. Tears streamed down her cheeks. Darling Lillian, I've missed you so much. Lily's cast had been removed the day before, and her arm was as good as new. She ran to close the distance and fell against her grandmother's chest, wrapping her little arms around the woman's neck. Beside Grace, Andrew tightened his hold and kissed her head. There was nothing to say. The child she loved with all her heart didn't belong to her. Never had. She'd loved and lost enough in her life. Her mother. Though the woman was still alive, Grace had lost her love a long time before. Her father, Celia, now Lily. At one point, she'd thought she'd never be able to love again. She'd believed her love inadequate, faulty. She'd believed herself flawed because her love had never been enough. But she'd been wrong. Her love would never be the kind of love that saved. But it was good and worth sharing. Even when it hurt. This hurt. Wow, did this hurt? With Lily's hand in hers, Darla stood. Come on in, beautiful girl. Meet the family. When Lily stepped inside, Darla faced Grace and held open her arms. Grace stepped into them, accepting the hug. feeling Darla's sobs against her shoulder. "Thank you." Words clogged in her throat. All Grace could do was nod. They went inside to find that the family was all there. Grace and Andrew were introduced to Lily's great-uncle and cousins of every age and size. Except for the children, who seemed more stunned than anything, every member of Lily's family cried. After some awkward questions and conversation, Lily found a girl about her age, her cousin Brittany, and disappeared with her and the young boys down the hall. Regis padded behind them, delighting the children. They all seemed perfectly at ease. A few more pieces of Grace's heart seemed to crumble and fall away. The teenagers slumped down on sofas to look at their phones, and the adults went into the kitchen, where they focused on Grace and Andrew, as if the two knew the secrets of the universe. Which they didn't, but they knew enough. It was Rex, Darla's brother, who started. "Tell us about this place he took you and Lily Ann." Grace's gaze flicked to Andrew, who scooted a little closer to her. He must have seen the emotion in her expression, because he described the place and how they'd found it, as Lily's family leaned in with rapt attention. He'd built a false wall in the basement. Behind it was his studio and a little bedroom for Lily and Grace. Darla's face paled, while Rex's turned bright red. "What kind of man shoves a kid into a windowless room like that?" he demanded. Grace swallowed hard. "One who only thinks about himself and his needs. A narcissistic psychopath." "What did they find there?" Rex asked. "Boxes and boxes of photographs, printed photographs, old school style, and all the evidence of his—" Andrew's voice trailed. But Darla and Rex and the rest of the family knew what Lily had been forced to do. "The good news is," Andrew said, "there's zero evidence that Lily's been assaulted." "There's that." Rex laid his hand on his sister's shoulder. "It could be worse." Darla's head bobbed, tears dribbling down her cheeks. She didn't say much. She had to feel conflicted, thrilled to have her granddaughter home while grieving the daughter who'd never walk through the door. Once they told the family all they knew, Grace hugged Lily goodbye and promised to see her the next day. She planned to hang around for a few days until Lily got settled, and then she'd return to New Hampshire with Andrew and try to figure out how to go on with a gaping hole in her heart.
Chapter 39. Andrew stepped onto the private jet where his father, Chet, and Harrison Ackerman waited. He greeted all three with handshakes. He'd have hugged his dad if his shoulder and arm didn't still hurt so badly. "Let's sit," Dad said. They did so at the table where Andrew, Lily, and Grace had been less than 2 weeks before. Felt like months, but a lot had happened since then. "I assume you have an answer for me." Beside him, Dad's gaze flicked to Chet and Harrison on the other side of the table. "And I assume we all needed to be here to hear it." Andrew set his bag on the table and pulled out the report he'd drawn up. Chet's eyes were narrowed as if he were annoyed, but the way his lips were pressed together, tight at the corners, gave away that he was nervous. Harrison, on the other hand, looked comfortable, coolly confident. "Why'd we have to fly all the way to Texas for this?" "Dad wanted the information ASAP, Andrew said. "Grace needs to hang around here another couple of days until Lily feels comfortable, and I'm not leaving her alone." Andrew'd woken up Saturday morning to find his dad at his hospital bedside. Grace had called and filled him in. It wasn't as if they'd had some deep man-to-man, heart-to-heart. They hadn't needed to. Dad's thoughts had been so clear that they might as well have been printed in a cartoon bubble over his head. Andrew'd gripped his hand, and Dad had squeezed, and it was enough. Now Dad looked at him with an expression that could only be described as pride. And Andrew's heart swelled just a little. It wasn't perfect, their relationship. But then, what relationships were? It was better, and it'd keep getting better, despite what Andrew needed to tell him. "Nah." He set his hand on the paperwork and addressed his brother. "Bookkeeping isn't your strong suit." Chet glowered at him. "I don't know what you think you found, but I've been doing some digging, even made a few calls. You're actually pretty good at some aspects of running a business. You've expanded into new markets, signed new clients." Chet leaned back against his chair. Apparently stunned that Andrew had said something complimentary, he seemed to be waiting for the punchline. There wasn't one, though. Chet wasn't a complete incompetent. "But admit it, you're not so great at the books." Chet didn't argue. His shrug was all the agreement Andrew was going to get. Andrew turned his attention to Harrison. You didn't want Dad to get me out of prison. Harrison's lips stretched into a smile. I thought you were guilty. To be honest, son, I still do. The last thing we needed was a criminal working for us, and I knew your father'd give you a chance. That might be true, Andrew said, but I think it's also true that you like your position at the company. You have a lot of power. Harrison seemed unfazed. I don't know where you think you're going with this. Andrew turned to Dad. You wanted me to take over. When I bowed out, you wanted Chet to take over. But what happens if Chet can't because he's in prison for embezzling? Dad turned to Harrison and held there. He didn't say anything. Andrew slid the report to his father, who skimmed it. Then Dad's gaze went back to Harrison, his eyes filled with confusion and hurt. Andrew focused on Chet, the only one at the table who didn't know what was going on. Harrison was supposed to be teaching you how to keep the books. Chet's shoulders dropped. He looked at their dad, then back at Andrew. He was trying. I wanted Dad to think I'd gotten over. I have this thing, dyscalculia. It's like dyslexia, only with numbers. No matter how hard I try, I just can't seem to make them work. I knew about that, Dad said. It's why I asked Harrison to help you. I didn't realize. Harrison was seated between Chet and the window, and though he made no move, Andrew could feel the man's desire to escape. He was glad Chet either didn't feel it or didn't care. Andrew got to the point. Harrison skimmed just under $100,000 since Chet took over. He did his very best to make it look like Chet was the guilty party. But I followed the trail. He glared at the man he used to call Uncle. You're good. I'm better. Harrison held Andrew's gaze, then turned to Dad. Obviously, they're in on it together. The accusation wasn't worth responding to. Andrew stood and looked down at the three men. Chet seemed relieved, a little embarrassed. Harrison was pulling himself together, about to come up with some long story about how Andrew and Chet were trying to swindle their father. It'd probably be amusing to watch, considering that the brothers had never even been able to shovel a driveway without arguing. But Dad seemed heartbroken. He loved his sons, but he loved his oldest friend too. All the evidence has been forwarded to your assistant, Andrew said to his dad. I considered sending it straight to the authorities, but that's up to you. Dad stood and wrapped Andrew in a hug, which Andrew returned with one arm. The other ached where Dad squeezed, but he wouldn't have missed that hug for the world. I love you, son. Andrew stepped back. I love you, Dad. He gripped Chet's shoulder. Let's try a little harder, okay? Chet shrugged. Whatever, but his lips twitched like he might smile. Thanks for not, pinning the whole thing on you out of sheer pettiness. Don't think I didn't consider it, but he kept amusement in his tone. At the end of the day, you're the only brother I have. He didn't bother to speak to Harrison. There was nothing to say. He left the three men to sort out their issues on the long flight back to New Hampshire. Maybe it wasn't the kindest way to handle this, having them come to Texas, but Dad had insisted. Now he'd have to deal with the fallout. Maybe someday Andrew would accept his dad's offer to take over at Middleton. Maybe he and Chet could even learn to work together. For now, Andrew was happy at B&B. He was happy in Coventry. And he was happy with Grace, who planned to stay right in the condo across the lot. It was enough, for now.
Chapter 40. Grace dumped the contents of her new favorite mug into the kitchen sink. This one had been imprinted with a photo of herself and Lily, a gift from Andrew a few weeks earlier, just because. When she left Lily with her grandmother, she'd felt a hole rip open in her heart, a hole she'd been sure would never be filled. But somehow, the hole didn't make her weaker. There was an old saying that a bone would grow back stronger after it had been broken. She didn't know if that was true, but she was starting to realize that when a broken heart was treated properly, it did grow back stronger. Hers was, anyway, because rather than running away and cutting herself off from society after losing Lily, she'd run home to Coventry and allowed herself to be surrounded by friends, some of whom she'd not even met before. Somehow, she had a community here, people she was just starting to get to know but already cared about. Not just Cassidy and James, though they were a part of it, but friends of Andrew's from work, from church, and from the condo development. They'd gathered around Andrew when she and Lily had been taken, and gathered around Grace when she'd come home from Texas without the child she'd fallen in love with. So, yes, there was a hole in her heart, but it was shrinking, or maybe her heart was just expanding into it, thanks to all the wonderful people who'd become her community. And Andrew, who'd offered a shoulder to cry on more than once. He'd distracted her. He'd encouraged her to work at the youth center. She'd agreed to help out while Cassidy was on maternity leave. Cassidy hadn't had the baby yet, but in the course of training and preparing, Grace remembered how much she loved working with young people. It was hard and messy, and sometimes heartbreaking, but it was rewarding. But the hole was filling, mostly thanks to God, who'd held her close and whispered truth into her ears. Truth about who she was and whose she was, about her gift, her value, and how he loved her. At the sound of a knock, she opened the door. Andrew stood on the other side. Before she could say a word, he pulled her into an embrace and kissed her senseless. When he backed away, he looked down at her with that smoldering expression that had only grown warmer in the month since they'd returned from Texas. It took her more than a moment to get her bearings. "I missed you," he said. She giggled like a girl. "I saw you yesterday." "An eternity." "Goofball." He helped her into her wool coat. She slipped on her gloves, not because she feared holding his hand. She loved holding his hand, though it could be distracting, but because it was downright frigid outside. "Why are we doing this again?" "It's tradition." After she locked up, they walked hand in hand toward the park. Others who lived in the development were making their way to the common area where a giant Christmas tree had been erected. Grace had helped decorate it the day before, not even minding when the pushy Mrs. O'Malley came along behind her and fixed what she'd done. Barely batting an eye when the nosy Mrs. Peterson fished for details about her relationship with Andrew. They were a part of her circle now. Moms and dads and kids and single people and retirees, all doing life together in this weird little community. She loved it, loved everything about it. How had she ever thought she was meant to live separated from the world? The lies she'd told herself, the lies that had been whispered into her ear by a very busy and very cruel enemy, were just that. Lies. Slowly and carefully, Grace was learning to replace those lies with truth. She was valuable, she was lovable, she was fully capable of love. Andrew squeezed her hand. "I wish I could read your mind the way you read my emotions." He gave her an expectant look. That was the deal they'd made. He shared everything with her. The least she could do was open herself up to him. "I was thinking how much I love this. How I was barely living before I met Lily." She bumped his shoulder with her own. "And you. Did you talk to her this morning?" "Yeah, she's so happy." Grace's voice cracked on that last word, not with sadness, but with joy. It had cost her to give her heart to Lily, and then to give Lily back to her grandmother. But what she'd gained, what Lily had gained, had been worth every tear. I bet theirs was a joyous Thanksgiving. Indeed, it had been. Grace had heard the tears in Darla's voice when she'd told her about the day with all the family. "Ours was too," Grace said. "I wouldn't change a thing." They'd gone to Andrew's dad's for the holiday. Apparently, Andrew had spent every Thanksgiving and Christmas with his mom since he'd been old enough to make the choice. But this year, his mom told him to make other arrangements and booked herself on a cruise. Grace loved her, that older version of Andrew, full of life and joy. She seemed genuinely thrilled that Andrew was repairing his relationship with his dad, and she'd welcomed Grace like a long-lost daughter. Andrew's family were good, kind, and generous people. Knowing the man, she wasn't at all surprised. The tree lighting ceremony was typical, short and sweet, with the president of the condo association thanking those who'd done the work. Moments after the sun went down, the tree lit up. It wasn't Rockefeller Center, but it was pretty. And then the group huddled closer and sang Silent Night. Listening to all those voices raised in honor of Jesus, she couldn't help the tears that streamed down her face. Life was so good. When the song was over, she turned to Andrew to thank him for insisting they go. but the place where he'd stood was empty. He was kneeling, looking up at her with sparkles in his eyes. The reflection from the tree, yes. And love, pure love. Slowly, he tugged off her gloves, then took her hands so she could feel what he was feeling. "I was happy before I met you," he said. "I had everything I needed. But then you came into my life and showed me this whole new part of myself. You taught me fearlessness and sacrificial love. I'm not perfect, neither are you. But I see glimpses of the perfect creature God created in you. I want to be a part of that. I want to walk alongside you and watch you grow into the woman He made you to be. I want you alongside me as I try to grow into the man He made me to be. Our love will never be perfect, but it can be good. I think we can be good, together. Will you marry me?" She couldn't force words past the emotions clogging her throat. She managed a nod. "Yes?" he clarified. She swallowed. "Yes! Yes!" He slipped a diamond ring off the end of his pinky and slid it onto her finger. It was beautiful, but it was nothing compared to the man who'd given it to her. He stood and wrapped her in his arms. After a kiss that didn't last nearly long enough, he backed away, turned to the crowd, and shouted, "She said yes!" And then, somehow, they were surrounded by friends. Jackie and Reed and Ella, Braden and Carly, and their beautiful infant girl. James and Cassidy, whose coat would no longer close over her baby bump. Tabby and Fitz, along with Fitz's sister, Shelby. Even Chelsea and Dylan had made it, the gorgeous heiress and her red-headed husband. Garrett, Thomas, and other neighbors watched. Andrew's father slapped Andrew on his back. "Well done, son." Christine pulled Grace into a hug. Even Chet was there, standing near his sisters and their families. He looked a little happy for his big brother, maybe a little jealous, but he was trying. That was all anybody could do. "I hope you don't mind a crowd," Andrew said, "but this is your family now." He didn't just mean the Middletons, he meant all of them, the friends, the neighbors, family. She hadn't realized how badly she'd longed for a family, how badly she'd needed one, until she came to Coventry. She'd given up Lily, but look at all she'd gained. "I couldn't be happier, Andrew Middleton." He wrapped her in his arms again and gave her the first kiss of the rest of their lives.
You've been listening to Touch of Innocence, written by robinpatchen, narrated by Brian, Matilda, and Callum. Copyright 2022 by robinpatchen. Audio copyright 2024 by robinpatchen.